Welcome, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we are visiting history, but really, we're visiting the atrocities that were placed on a people. I'm talking about the Tulsa Massacre. This morning, our guest is Anneliese Bruner. She is the great granddaughter of Mary E. Jones Parrish, and she is sharing their story, but really a story that her grandmother penned all those years ago. We welcome her to the OPT Network for the very first time. Anneliese Bruner, good morning and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate this opportunity.
I said to you before we started, The Nation Must Awake is the name of the book. My witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 is probably one of the most saddest books that I have read, and really, as many Americans, seen, the stories as they have come out in the media all these years later. First of all, give us the context about your great grandmother and who she was.
Well, I am like her in some ways. I am a writer and an editor, and I have done reporting. Um, and that is a role that she served within her community. She was known because she taught at the local YMCA, the Bunton branch, there in North Tulsa / Greenwood, for our people. She taught secretarial skills. She taught women, particularly who were entering the workforce at that time, how to type, how to do shorthand, stenography, things that would permit them to earn a gainful and honest living in a professional capacity. And so she did very important work in her community and among the women there. She also had her own private school where she did the same. And for those who could afford private instruction, she had students that she taught these same skills, office management, how to conduct yourself, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And she was, in fact, wrapping up a class that she had just dismissed at about 9 p.m. on May 31st of 1921 when the tragedy began to unfold,
And
straight from work into the disaster.
wow. And so, as a little girl, what did you know about the Tulsa Massacre, and what was it called? What did people think about the atrocities? Because that's really all that you can say. It was terrorism right here on American soil.
You have named it correctly. You have called it what it was, terrorism on American soil. But let me tell you, like many victims of atrocities, to use your word again, people were silent. This is the same phenomenon that we see with people who survived the Holocaust, the Shoah. Uh, the first generation or second generation, even, but particularly the first generation, they didn't speak about it. And so there is a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Judith Lewis Herman who says this is what we mean when we say unspeakable. It is difficult for the human mind to process these kinds of atrocities and then to have ease about speaking uh, about them. And so, as a little girl, I didn't know a thing about this. I didn't know my great grandmother and my grandmother, the small girl in the story who tells her mother, I see men with guns when the tragedy was unfolding. She never said a word. My father didn't say anything until I was about 34, 35 years old. And he gave me the book itself, of which the copy you have is a reprint 100 years later. So we did not grow up with knowledge of this, direct knowledge of this. But
Wow.
once I had read the book uh, and saw that most people that I knew nothing about this, uh, I knew that it was important and it was something that our community and the nation at large needed to know about.
The world needed
Yes,
to know. And so tell me
yes.
about the conversation with your dad when he hands you your great grandmother's writing, and how had that been preserved for all of those years?
Well, it's very interesting because um, I can recall explaining it to other people, and they just thought it was a manuscript or something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually a book that she had put together. She was contracted to do some of the reporting,
Mm-hmm.
and she wrote down her own eyewitness account. I mean, it's terrifying when you see and you think that this is a young woman in her late 20s or early 30s with a 7-year-old responsible for her own life and for the life of her child, making a decision about whether she should stay in her home or should she flee and risk being shot. But as my father gave me this book, he didn't say very much. He had obviously read through it. I opened the book when he gave it to me. He pulled it from among his papers and he said, "Your great grandmother wrote this book, Lisa." I was called Lisa when I was small.
Mm-hmm.
"And I want you to see if you can do anything with it,
Wow.
with this book."
Mm-hmm.
It was a red cloth bound book, not very big. And when you opened it, it was, some of the pages were a little bit brittle. And the inscription said, "To William Bruner Jr., my father, from Carroll A. Jones," one of his cousins, who was related, obviously, to Mary Jones Parrish, had given it to him on a trip to Tulsa, back home to Tulsa. I'm from San Francisco.
Wow.
So it was a heavy thing for him to lay on me because not only the events themselves, but why had I never heard of this? Why had no one said anything to me or to anyone else in the family? It was a shock.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think made him, after all those years, unearth this and give it to you and say, see if you can do something with this?
Well, at the time, he said to me, "You're now the matriarch of the family." And I took it as a charge. I was confused and I didn't know exactly what he meant. But I guess he meant, you've reached a certain age.
Mm-hmm.
He was a person who had grown up under strong matriarchal figures in the family. And out of his 4 natural children, he picked me as the one to best perpetuate our family legacy. I guess he just thought, okay, she has demonstrated the interest in the literary world and in family history more so than others.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to entrust her with this. That is how I felt. And I felt I was charged.
Wow. Let me get a break here, but when we come back, we'll talk about the weight of carrying such an incredible story that very few people in America, let alone the world, knew about the Tulsa Massacre and the atrocities that had been perpetrated on innocent people, but it had all been really carefully documented by Anneliese's great grandmother. Stay on point. We're back with more of their story right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we're sharing a story that many people saw for the first time, maybe within the last year, and understood that a massacre had happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Well, our guest this morning is Anneliese Bruner. She is the great-granddaughter of Mary E. Jones Parrish, who wrote shortly after she came in with all of these eyewitness accounts. And somehow her writing and her documentation was unearthed by your dad, and he gives it to you. And the book is entitled something else, but you changed the title to "The Nation Must Awake: My Witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. So I'm wondering, like, Anneliese, when you get this book, this very antique, delicate book, and you start to read it, and you start to hear everything that your grandmother, because it's the writings are so present that you could transport yourself. It's almost like a movie. You could transport yourself back to that night where people that had worked their whole lives, that were business owners and doctors, and just had created really a city within the city of Tulsa. They were swept up and swept out of their homes by gunfire. What do you think when you read that for the first time? Do you think, is this true? What is, how do you process that?
I felt immediately that it was true. I had no doubt whatsoever. Casting a doubt on what eyewitnesses have said verbally over the years has been a favorite tactic of those who did not want the truth to be unearthed. And when I read this, particularly because in my course of studies, I've understood that, for example, slave narratives were, that were some that were collected before that generation of people died out. There was doubt cast upon what they said. Said, "Oh, could this possibly be true? Oh, if people were valuable in enslavement, how could they possibly have been treated so horribly? No one would do that." Well, I know my grandmother used to say, one of my grandmothers, there's a lion that sleeps in the heart of a man. And, people we see are capable of many, many horrible things, especially as they perpetrate them upon other human beings, without grace or mercy. And so when I saw this, I knew immediately that it was true. I had no question in my mind. And over the years, it has been vindicated by the studies of others who perhaps had more of a voice, more of a public presence than my grandmother, great grandmother, who had almost been relegated to the dustbins of history, if you will, because before this latest publication, she was not broadly known, but scholars knew her because, as Dr. Scott Ellsworth will say, and he admits it freely, hers was the primary and sole account that was written contemporaneously in real time, as we call it now, of the events, not coordinated with anyone. These were things that she witnessed and wrote down about her own experience, things that she reported on directly from eyewitnesses who couldn't possibly have coordinated lies or a fabrication of this level. And so the details that she provides underpin all of those years of people and their oral testimonies, which have not been valued, underpins the truth and gives evidentiary support that would be admissible in a court of law because it is something that was written contemporaneously. Those notes were taken at the time, and this is what sets this work apart.
And so I think it's important for the context of the work and the massacre that happened, because the question that I asked too was, why did this happen? Why did this happen to a people, Black people, who were prosperous, who were thriving? Why did this happen? And we learn why in the book this happened, and it all seems so senseless. Tell us about that encounter that a white girl or a white woman had with a Black boy on the elevator.
Well, I will describe it, but I would like to preface my description by saying it was a pretext. There was, as Dr. Julianne Malveaux will say, noted economist, there was economic envy of the success and of the wealth of Greenwood at the most basic level. At the more sophisticated level, there was land lust for the real estate that they were sitting on, because Tulsa was an oil city and it was expanding. It had money, and the developers and city fathers wanted that land. And so there was a confluence of interest in the land And the violence of the mob was really that the intersection of those two dynamics. Now, back to the story that you mentioned, which was the precipitating event, but not really the cause.
Mm-hmm.
We know how that goes. So there was a young man, 19 years old, Dick Rowland, who was a shoe shine in the Drexel building, apparently, and a young woman, Sarah Page, young white woman, 17 years old, was the elevator operator. And it was one of the few buildings where Black people could go to use the facilities. And so apparently he was known to this person in the elevator. He wasn't a stranger to her. And some type of event happened, and she got startled and let out a scream or a gasp or whatever. And he fled because within the context of the time, and even now, if a white woman screams and there's a Black man in proximity, that could lead to someone's death. It has, and in this case, he probably feared that that's what was going to happen to him. He was apprehended and taken into custody and was in the jail. And sure enough, the media, newspapers, the Tulsa Tribune specifically, began to send out inflammatory headlines. Negro to be lynched, nabbed Negro. I mean, just, the whole nine. And as could have been predicted, a white mob assembled thinking that, white womanhood had been threatened. And, there were some disputed events that went on, but Black people in the community, and this was an active, as you said, a proud community, a community with agency, a community of doers. And so many of them were veterans also of World War I who had returned to Tulsa from the European theater. They were armed, they were organized, and they were determined. And they went down to protect this young man, not intent on starting problems, but on preventing one. Nevertheless, in the course of that evening, there was a white man his sensibilities were offended that Black people had the nerve, the audacity, the self-regard, the dignity to go down there and to demand that this young man be spared from this mob and that he just face the court, the bar of justice as any other human being, any other U.S. citizen would expect to be able to.
But for that time though, Anneliese, it's astounding that they were so sure and so unafraid that they organized and said this will not happen in 1921.
I think that we, in many ways today, because of how history has been crafted and many of the things that we don't know and that we have not talked about within our families, I think we forget that we're not the first generation of Black folks to be sophisticated, to know what was going on in the world, to have a sense of self-respect and dignity, and to understand our innate worth. These people exercised that. They were not cowed, they were not afraid, and they felt that they would be successful. Clearly, there was some influence from the fact that they had fought for this country, for their nation, for their home, for democracy abroad. That was not lost on them, that rhetoric of the time, and those values were alive and well. Values of reward for hard work, sacrifice to get what you wanted, personal dignity and responsibility. All of those things were exemplified in the Tulsa community. In North Tulsa, in the Greenwood community.
Absolutely.
And so they put on their hat, so to speak, and they went down there to make sure that justice was going to prevail in the situation.
Indeed.
They, if you can imagine, were the protectors of democracy and justice, while those who were in power were just the opposite.
Indeed. Let me get a break here, but when we come back, we'll talk about the nation must awake. Stay on point. We're back with more right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is Anneliese Bruner. She, in herself, is an incredible writer and has told many stories, but I'm sure that no story has been as powerful and so important to American history as your great-grandmother's story. Did you really think about how important this story was, and you are now one of the keepers of this story and how it will go out into the world? I mean, what goes into your mind when you think of that?
You really have captured the essence right there. This is the most significant story of my life. Not only my great grandmother's story, but my grandmother's story, because I know what became of the little girl who lived through that terrible time. And I do feel that this will be my mission going forward, is sharing this story with the world. But the story, in terms of how important it was, I realized how important it was, but I had no idea at that time how I was going to get this story out, how I was going to make this available, not just to my few friends who I talked about, about it to constantly, not to just, the magazine I was working for
Right.
at the time. What was I going to do to make sure that this story got its due? And coincidentally, around the same time that I got the book is when Tulsa itself, the residents of Greenwood, people who stayed and who knew the story, they began to organize around, it was the late 90s, around the way that this story had been squelched and had been actively and in a very organized fashion suppressed. Because what people who are watching you today may not understand is how organized a campaign of silencing, uh, how powerful that was, how effective that was, and what that did to people. Mother Fletcher, who went before Congress and testified to her own experience of fleeing, they fled in a covered wagon. She and her brother, Uncle Red Van Ellis, they fled in a covered wagon, as planes flew overhead. So just think about the meeting of the eras there. People were still, some were in
Right.
automobiles and trucks, some were in the horse-drawn buggy. There were planes flying overhead. I mean, what a scenario this is, and what a story. And as you say, it's like something out of a movie. You
It
can
did.
hardly believe
And
it.
then when they talk about the planes, their accounts, they say the planes weren't just flying overhead, they were flying low. Can you imagine
Buzzing people.
flying low and just, taking people out? And so what year did your dad give you your great grandmother's story? And then how do you then say, because this is not just a story, this is history. So the responsibility and the mission is, like you said, it's to get it to, if not the world, but certainly America. And so that in itself has to be a task.
It is a task. And, I spent 10 days in Tulsa, and I talked to any number of people just trying to share this story, share my perspective on it, but more important, share the historical significance of what my great grandmother did, what she survived, and what she was able to muster, what she was able to put together to make sure that this was preserved in perpetuity. Now, apparently, there was somewhat of a run of these books, maybe about 25 or so. They think about 25 or 26 were ever printed and are apparently somewhere in existence. I did hear when I was in Tulsa one survivor family member said that she does have a copy under lock and key of the book itself. But I know of about, I think, three people, two in addition to myself, who have it. But it is very valuable. It is very rare. There have been a couple of reprints, but nothing on this scale, and nothing with this level of marketing effort behind it to try to make sure that this story is known, preserved, and incontrovertible. Because there's no way to say now that this is not true.
Hmm.
I have read stories that began to come out in the press that said, oh, neighborhood lore says there were planes. This is not neighborhood lore. This is fact.
Hmm. And so, when you bring this story to the governor and to people in leadership in Tulsa, how do they respond to this account of this massacre that happened 100 years ago? Well, it wasn't
While I
probably
was in
100 years ago at the time when you brought it to them, but we're 100 years now.
Well, I had not, I was not the person who first brought this to most prominent prior to this publication. That would have been Dr. Ellsworth, who contacted me in January of this year after I wrote a story that was published in the Washington Post about the insurrection that happened here in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol building, 5 miles from where I live. And my mind raced straight back to my great grandmother's story and the mob that destroyed her community. This mob in January of this year was seeking to destroy and overturn democracy itself. And that's actually where that sentiment is where the title of the book comes. If
Mm.
these anti-democratic forces who are willing to engage in organized political violence, if they are not stopped, there is no end in sight. They won't stop with, as my great grandmother would say, with the colored people.
Mm.
They'll go on and tell the whole country down, basically. And that's exactly what we saw. What she warned of, we saw it on January 6th. And so not only was she a person of her time, she was a person ahead of her time. She predicted with great clarity that if these forces, these people who, some with the complicity of government officials, are not stopped, you know, there's no way that we can assure that we will have, a country to call home anymore. These people are destructive and they must be stopped. The nation must awake to this truth from
Hmm.
1921, from 2021.
Right. And there are a few pictures of the destruction. I wonder if there is any documentation or footage of how rife and rich this community in Tulsa had been before, because when you read the book, you can just envision, like I said, a city within a city independent of itself, with its own everything. I mean, from restaurants to hotels to boutiques. I mean, just everything in it was beautifully crafted and self-sufficient and not depending on the government, not depending on the white man or anybody for a handout. These were homeowners, these were educators, these were people educated, these were blue collar workers and white collar workers. They were just a people living the American dream.
Living the American dream. What a great description. That's exactly right. What I would say is that the community did have pretty much everything. One thing it did not have, however, was a bank. And so this leads us to another very interesting interpretation of the situation. Because without a bank, what do people do?
Hmm.
They keep their money in their Bible, in their mattress, in their closets, wherever. So when your home is burned down, not only is your greatest
Right.
investment burned down, but your cash is gone. cash that you had worked and sacrificed for. Perhaps you were going to educate your children with it. Perhaps you were going to start a business with it. Perhaps you were going to travel to another state for a new beginning. Any number of things. Your possibilities are then cut off. You are amputated from your very own future.
Mm.
And so this is, I mean, the loss of not just material wealth, the loss of currency, the loss of hopes and dreams. This is what was lost here.
And you know
And
what else I felt, Anneliese? I felt their dignity was lost. These were a proud people. And in that moment, they lost their dignity because they were relegated to second-class citizens.
they were reduced in stature. Exactly. I mean, my great grandmother herself says, I'm standing here at the Goodwill for a change of clothing for myself and for my child. I, who have never worked for any white person in my entire life, and have always been able to earn, she said, not an extravagant living, but a decent living where I could, within reason, afford anything that I wanted.
Mm.
And so, yes, it was a come down. And I think that that was absolutely part of the game plan, because, as you see, people on trucks being taken out of the city or being taken to detention camps and things of this nature, marched through the street with their hands up without so much some as shoes or a hat on their head to defend their skin from the brutal sun. Part of it was to strip people of their dignity.
You know what I love about that statement that you just quoted from your grandmother's book and her saying that, but even in that, she said she never had to ask anybody for anything and could reasonably afford what she wanted, but she still had gratitude. Even though these were secondhand rags, really, for them to put on, she was still found a way to be grateful even in that. Even
She
in
did.
that
And she
moment.
said she found purpose in talking to the other people and was able basically to, subsume her own interest into a compassion for others and
Mm-hmm,
what they had lost and what they had
mm-hmm,
endured. And so, when she describes the people walking through the devastated landscape after June 1st, by June 2nd, when they
mm-hmm.
were, back in town. Yeah,
And
it
so
was.
as you carry this message, Anneliese, what has been the response of people like myself and many others who just had no idea about this story? What are people saying to you?
Well, one thing that I say, I have a couple of ways I would respond to that. Mayor Bynum of Tulsa has said that people in the present day should not be punished for what some criminals did um, in the past. And
Mm-hmm.
this was in response to the demand and the lawsuit for reparations. And what I would say to him and others, I would invite them to think about it as a way to promote justice, restoration, and the making whole of the descendants of their neighbors. Um, the descendants of the massacre, their very neighbors. Um, but more broadly, I would say to people, this is the reckoning that Dr. John Hope Franklin talks about in the introduction. We have not had a reckoning. And until we do, these issues will continue to remanifest. They'll continue to bubble up within our culture and our society, and they will continue to tarnish our reputation in the world because it will prevent us from being taken seriously when we talk about human rights, dignity, justice, equality for all. We have to get our own house in order. And this book gives us the blueprint as we look backward, and it gives us the blueprint as we look forward to what we must do. We must awake to the truth of, and I say this as a collective, of our own perfidy and our own, we're all in this together, and we have to have a reckoning, and we do have to have reparative justice,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the message here. And yes, I do support cash reparations here in this instance. Also, for the continued enslavement of African Americans historically. This is a mission that we should all be working on together. And also, in particular, for the three elderly survivors who are still with us and who need to be cared for.
How
Their
old are
dignity
they,
needs to be
Anneliese?
restored.
Do we know how old, you
Mother
know?
Fletcher is 107 years old,
Wow.
same age as my grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
the small child in the story would be. Her baby brother, Uncle Red Van Ellis, is 100.
Wow.
And I believe Mother Randall is 106.
And they're still here. Have you been able to, are their minds still sharp and because that's a trauma that will never be forgotten.
Uh, they are still sharp. They have not forgotten, and they are able to very well articulate what they went through then and what they want now.
Mm. Wow. It is a powerful story, and God bless you, Anneliese, for having the courage to be vigilant in sharing this story and what happened 100 years ago to people who were rich in spirit, who were rich in community, who were rich in so many ways. And it is a story that every one of us, not just Black history, but people who value what happened in history and who want to understand history, it's a book that you have to read. It's a hard read. It's hard to fathom that this happened in America in 1921, but it did. And so God bless you for the work that you're doing and the work that you will do. The book is entitled The Nation Must Awake, My Witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Before you got to go, Anneliese, tell people how they can connect with getting the book and how they can connect with all that you're doing.
Yes, thank you so much for that opportunity. The book is available by going online and typing in tulsabook.com. Very simple to remember. That's Tulsa Book, no dots, no hyphens, no underlines, tulsabook.com. And all purchasing information is available there. You can get it. It doesn't have to come through a big retailer. So there are some opportunities there. And I am available at AnnelieseMBruner.com.
There you go. Anneliese, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for all that you're doing to be an agent of change in our world.
Thank you.
Indeed. Hey, everybody, stay on point. We're back right after this.